Hi, I'm just going to jump on a thread here that Ron Haggerty at Vinyl Sanctuary started today. And this is 10 bands who eventually found their sound. My first pick is going to be the Moody Blues. This is the American version of their first album, which in the UK was titled The Magnificent Moodies. Basically, it's a lot of R&B. There's a couple of covers here. There's actually a version of It Ain't Necessarily So, which is a Gershwin song. I'm not sure if that was in a musical. I don't know that much about George Gershwin, but there's just it sounds almost a lot like the Who's first album, where it's very much R&B, it's very much pop oriented, very radio friendly for the mid 60s, and it sounds nothing like any of their later work would do. Their next album, which was Days of Future Past, was such a radical shift where you've got the orchestration, more extended progressive type music, featuring the Mellotron. Just the stuff that the Moody Blues would be known for is nowhere on evidence in this album, but they definitely extended their sound over the next couple of albums, and definitely they found it, I would say, by the end of 1967. The next band is The Who, speaking of an album of old R&B covers, I wouldn't say old R&B covers, some of these are contemporary. They cover James Brown on here. The originals that are on here very much are kind of that mid-60s R&B, just sort of what passed for contemporary pop back in the time, but you don't really get the sense that this is a band that would, within the space of 3 years, start writing rock operas and would totally revamp their sound into a much heavier, guitar-oriented, riff-oriented kind of a band. I mean, The Who were one of the heaviest bands of the 60s, but you don't really get that sense here. Pete Townsend is just starting out as a songwriter, and so even his songwriting abilities haven't fully developed. And so it's just this is a real safe album for The Who. It's not a bad album, but it doesn't sound anything. Even their next album, a quick one, they would stretch out musically and incorporate some more psychedelic sounds, a little more acid rock. And then by The Who Sell Out, their third album, they were in full on, kicking ass and just kind of highlighting Pete Townsend's brilliant songwriting. The next band is Pink Floyd. Now, granted, they lost Syd Barrett after their first album. I wouldn't say they lost him, but I mean, they definitely lost him to mental illness. But this was definitely a psychedelic, Syd Barrett focused album. Syd Barrett was the main singer-songwriter here, and so some of it has a very childlike quality to it. His lyrics sometimes read as poetry or in some cases nursery rhymes, and it's got a very much, even though it's very psychedelic, there's still very much a pop sensibility to it. And only over the course of the next couple albums would Pink Floyd start improvising more and having what they recorded on albums actually sound closer to how they were as a live band. And it's hard to reconcile that the band that recorded this would eventually go on to record Dark Side of the Moon. But this is a great album. It just sounds very different from what Pink Floyd would become by the late 60s and into the 70s. The next band that I want to show is Traffic. This was their debut album, Mr. Fantasy. And this got a very much a psychedelic flavor to it. The tracks off here that are most notable would be Heaven Is In Your Mind, No Face, No Name, No Number, and Dear Mr. Fantasy. And it's more, I guess, psychedelic pop, for want of a better word, but they wouldn't really refine their sound until their next album. And then I think for me, their peak was John Barleycorn, Must Die. But their next album would have a much more organic, kind of an earthy sound. It would rely less on studio trickery and effects. This has got some nice, tight pop songs on it, but it also has some kind of British fluff on it also as well. And you don't really get an indication listening to this that this is a band that will eventually start stretching out and improvising more and doing more extended kinds of instrumentals and whatnot in their songs. So definitely Traffic is a band that eventually found their way and found their sound. Next band I want to cover is Roxy Music. This was their debut album, and this sounds a lot, kind of, you can tell they got the Velvet Underground influence on it. It's very much more kind of noisy and aggressive than what they would eventually become. Brian Ferry's singing voice is a little different, a little more strange and quirky. Brian Eno is in the band at this point, and so he very much influenced their sound and kind of the bizarre and unique instrumental style that they had. And eventually, over the course of their next couple albums, they would definitely, their songs would be more melodic, they'd be tighter, they'd have more kind of radio-friendly pop elements to it, but this is not a bad start. Another band that eventually found their sound is New Order. I know I'm kind of all over the board here with bands and styles of music, but New Order rose from the ashes of Joy Division after Ian Curtis committed suicide. And Joy Division was very much, they had a very kind of a gothic, real intense kind of a sound, very guitar based, very kind of a brooding sound. And with New Order, their first album is kind of that way. It's very guitar focused, very guitar oriented. It still has elements of the Joy Division sound. But after their next album, they would start to incorporate keyboards and synthesizers a bit more kind of danceable beats. And eventually they would go on to be one of New Wave Alternative's biggest acts in the late 80s. Next band is Wilco. Wilco, speaking of rising from the ashes, they were part of a band called Uncle Tupelo, and they were very much kind of an alternative country band. And Wilco's first album, Jeff Tweedy split, and his first album with Wilco following when he left, or I should say when Uncle Tupelo broke up, was very much kind of that country, alternative country style. He would start to branch out on their next release, and Being There, and then Summer Teeth absolutely bears no relationship to this album at all. And so Wilco definitely evolved from just being kind of that alternative country band into, definitely by the time Yankee Hotel Foxtrot came out, almost experimental in the sounds and textures, and in some cases using drum machines and incorporating more kind of aggressive guitar work and just different sounds, different ways of songwriting. So definitely one of my favorite bands, and one that sounded very different as time went on. Another band, Rush, their first album is very much shows their influences, a lot of Led Zeppelin, Cream, some Deep Purple sounds on here, but nothing really that would kind of show too much of a progressive rock influence, like they would start to, territory they would start to get into, beginning with, I guess, even their next album, Fly By Night, and then their third album, Caress of Steel, and then 2112. And so this is more just a heavy, solid, good rock album, but doesn't have so much of the progressive influence, and doesn't really, without Neil Peart on drums, it still has a different sound than how they would eventually sound in the later 70s. Same can be said for Yes. This first album, this has got a lot of kind of, I don't want to call it hippie music, but it's just very much a product of the late 60s. There is some sense of the sound that they were progressive rock pioneers, but there is not a whole lot of that in evidence on this album. I think they were still kind of finding their way, developing as musicians and developing as an act and as a unit. And then by their third album, the Yes album, they were in full-on progressive rock mode and writing some of the best classic rock songs of the 1970s. And the last band that I'm going to show is Radiohead. This was their first album, Pablo Honey, and it's got kind of I don't want to say paint by numbers, but it's still kind of that early guitar rock alternative, got some grunge elements in it, but they would go on with OK Computer to write and record one of the best albums of the 1990s, if not in all rock and roll. And some of their more experimental stuff would follow, including Kid A and some of their other albums, Hail to the Thief. But this is just a standard, really, guitar rock. There's not much in the way of experimentation like they would eventually evolve into. So that is my 10. Hope it's good enough, and I think it's a great thread. I hope a lot of people jump on it, but I wanted to do my contribution. Take care, everybody, and thanks for watching.